talking about the region, Ambassador, who are the other stakeholders and also who would be willing to work with India going forward?
Well, first of all, let me just address very briefly this question raised by Captain Bansal on the issue of talking to the Taliban. Well, we are not going to be talking to the Taliban directly as the Americans are doing. But it is, from my point of view, essential that we also have a seat at the table which decides the future of Afghanistan. We are a supporter of the government in Afghanistan, and it is important for that government to have as many of its friends also present at the table where its own future is decided. So, to put it briefly, we must be an active participant and have a rightful place in the negotiations relating to the future of Afghanistan.
That's a diplomat's perspective.
No, that's a strategically important perspective.
Right.
Who are the other stakeholders? Certainly, Iran is an important stakeholder. 25% or even more of the Afghan population is Shiite. And Iran wields considerable influence in the provinces which border it, as also in the northern provinces. Russia, for obvious reasons, is an important player. And so is China. So the Americans have unilaterally been deciding on issues which relate to matters which, really speaking, belong to a larger decision-making family. And very frankly, Mr. Trump has shown no great knowledge of Afghanistan, while his decisions seem to be the ones that are shaping things. He famously said that all that India has done is make a library there, which shows his vast ignorance of the subject. India has made dams, has made highways, has set up telecommunication projects. India has pumped in more than $3 billion of assistance to strengthen Afghanistan in a variety of ways. So, we should make sure that other stakeholders, including ourselves, are not left out, because leaving us out is precisely what Pakistan wants.
Right.
Pakistan's agent is the Taliban. The Taliban has been nurtured by Pakistan. Pakistan has used the Taliban to hurt India's interests. For instance, the abduction of 9 Indian engineers by the Taliban was certainly encouraged by the Pakistanis, who in any case made sure that the Taliban was in no rush or no hurry to release these engineers.
Right.
The Taliban have time and again claimed responsibility for attacks on Indian interests. Both the attacks on the Indian embassy in Kabul were attributed to the Taliban. Around the middle of January, in fact on 14th January, there was a bomb blast near Kabul airport in the highly fortified green area, green village. And that was carried out by the Taliban. So the Taliban's intentions or its behavior have not changed.
Right.
It remains hostile to the government in Kabul. It remains hostile to us. And therefore, in any set of negotiations that are taking place, we should make sure that the future of Afghanistan is not shaped by forces which are either indifferent to it, like the Americans now seem to be behaving, or by forces which are hostile to Kabul, like the Pakistanis. But well-wishers of the government are also present in those discussions and have a significant say.
Sure. Professor, the ambassador raised the point about how China is a stakeholder in the region and probably we can work with China. So is that an option really where India and China come together in Afghanistan, putting aside all other differences really, and work for stability in the region?
I think the Trump administration has left us with very few options in that regard. I think we have to have an understanding with the Chinese. And I think, if you recall, one of the first things in the Wuhan summit, one of the most significant announcements was about India and China working together in Afghanistan. So I think there has been some sense in the Indian policy-making circles, because this is a problem that this is something that has been gathering momentum for the last few months. And Indian policymakers have been subtly trying to reevaluate what they've been, their engagements with countries like Russia, China on this issue. So I think with China, there is a lot of potential to be exploited. It remains to be seen how it gets operationalized and whether the kind of hopes that we have that eventually China will be able to put pressure on Pakistan not to mar the prospects of such a Sino-Indian cooperation, that remains to be seen. But I think that's a very valid and important move going forward as we talk about the flux and as we talk of the changing security dynamic in the region. I think, the point, a larger point here is, and something that Alok touched upon, is ultimately a lot of this will depend on how strongly India stands up for its own interests. Because at the end of the day, Afghanistan is a hard power country. While we like to think that our television serials are very popular and they give us a soft power stake, at the end of the day, those who are willing to stand up and fight, they get counted. And I think this idea that we have is somehow our soft power in and of itself will make us very invaluable to the process, that has not borne out. And that has been going on for quite some time now. So I think that the aspect that Alok talked about in terms of strengthening ANA is perhaps the most important aspect of our engagement, or should be one of the most important aspects of our engagement, because if Afghanistan is to emerge as a strategically autonomous actor, it needs to have security forces that are able to take on the onslaught from the opponents, and which Taliban is going to come out with now that they know that Americans are going to go, they will not relent.
So just training the Afghan army is not enough, is what you're suggesting?
No, I think that is very important. That has to be taken on a much more broader footing. Because I think, on other issues, there is no consensus in this country. Let's be honest about it. If we say tomorrow that India should be fighting in Afghanistan, that's not going to happen. Because I don't think that's at the moment being discussed, or there is any political consensus. So I think what we can do to ensure the second line of operation would be that we have to build the capacity and war fighting capacity of the Afghan state, because that's where it would matter. Ultimately,
right,
they will have to fight it out on the battlefield, as they've been doing for quite some time. It was American presence that was sustaining that on the ANA front. Now it remains to be seen who comes and sustains that engagement.
Sure. Talking about China, Captain Bansal, on the one hand, you have Pakistan in the midst of all of this. China's very good old friend, of course. And then you have this other issue where China keeps scuttling India's entry into the NSG. Even most recently, they've said that India should be part of the non-proliferation treaty. Only then will it be allowed to be a part of the NSG. So how far can you really take China's word for it in Afghanistan?
See, nations have different views on different issues, and their interests are, as far as NSG is concerned, China's interests are there that India should not get into it, because China doesn't want India to come into it. So it's been blocking it. But as far as Afghanistan is concerned, there is some amount of congruence of interest. Please understand, the radicalization in Afghanistan, and for that matter in Pakistan, affects China directly. The communist state is extremely paranoid of religion-based radicalization or religion-based terrorism. In fact, their reactions to various religions, cults, etc. in China has been extremely knee-jerk. You could see it in Xinjiang, you could see a Falun Gong, you could even see against the Catholic Church recently, or those sort. Because an atheist society, so-called officially atheist society, does not understand what drives people driven by religion. And as a result, they are extremely paranoid. And this is one issue which they realize, that if Taliban becomes a component of government in Afghanistan, it will eventually overtake Afghanistan. And it often happens, you can go back into history and see that when you have a component of the government which has regimented forces outside, will eventually prevail. It happened in Czechoslovakia post Second World War. It would happen now in this sort of a scenario. And if Afghanistan comes under the sway of Taliban, it will, as I said, the ideology that it propagates will permeate across borders. And one of the targets is bound to be Xinjiang region, where Uyghurs have been persecuted by Chinese authorities. There is a massive re-education program, etc. going. So there is some amount of congruence. Second thing is, both China and India want to use the resources in Afghanistan, and we are actually committed to economic engagement with Afghanistan. And please understand, one of the biggest problems with Afghanistan is that Afghan National Army is competent, but Afghans' revenues are not sufficient to sustain that sort of a force. So you need to provide them revenues. As of now, the international community is paying for it. But ideal situation would be where Afghanistan has certain model of revenue generation by which it is able to keep that sort of force. Now, Afghanistan has some natural resources. Some people say that it's got some rare earth metals and things like that. Now, the problem has been, if these minerals are exploited, how do they travel? Because for India, which has been the traditional market for Afghanistan, if you go back into history, Afghanistan was a rentier state which actually thrived on the trade which passed through Afghanistan to India. Now Pakistan has blocked that access. Now if Afghanistan's resources have to be exploited by India, the only option till now has been Iran. But with President Trump and his belligerent stance towards Iran, that option also doesn't look very viable in long term. So maybe exploiting Afghanistan's resources or accessing Afghanistan and Central Asia through China could possibly be a viable option. So there seems to be a congruence, so we need to look at it. I'm not trying to say that you bank totally. Countries have to be cautious. What are Chinese postures? But government has made a stance that if US wants to unilaterally take decisions, and as Ambassador said, that President Trump's this get up from the bed and tweet sort of foreign policy, you can never be sure. Today he is doing something, tomorrow he might do something else, day after he might like to do something else. So in that sort of a scenario, you would want to have an ally which is far more dependable than somebody who changes his stance by the day. So I think there is no harm in collaborating. We are already collaborating with Iran. We need to also revive our close linkages with Russia and Central Asian states as far as Afghanistan is concerned. And then create an alliance which must be committed to ensuring the Taliban don't come to power in Kabul.
All right, quick closing comments from all my guests now. I'm going to ask you to be brief because I've got very limited time. Starting with you, first Ambassador, with the best way forward.
The biggest problem for us, I repeat, is going to be Pakistan. Because Pakistani stranglehold on the Taliban continues and becomes stronger by the day. And through the Taliban, Pakistan is able to act against our interests in Afghanistan. With the evacuation of American forces, the withdrawal of American forces, the Pakistani control over Taliban will become stronger. And through it, it will be able to endanger us more than it did in the past. So we will have to take stock of the situation and see how do we nullify Pakistani activities in Afghanistan. As Captain Bansal said, we can't be really going into Afghanistan. But we have to look at the possibility whether the UN could send forces in Afghanistan, because the American withdrawal does raise very serious security questions for that country.
Absolutely. Professor Pant?
Well, I think we need to be talking to various stakeholders, as has been pointed out, and perhaps finding out alternative mechanisms, whether be it with the Chinese or with the Russians or with the Iranians, and with the Central Asians, which I think have a stake in how Taliban evolves. Afghanistan evolves and Taliban gets sort of not as significant a role in the political process as perhaps they are trying to get. But also important would be how do you sustain, to make a case that sustainability of the legitimacy of the Ashraf Ghani government is very important, because it represents the evolution in Afghan polity, which needs to be sustained, and therefore you have to build its capacity to a point where it can sustain itself. And I think that's where India can play a very greater role perhaps than it has played so far.
Captain Bansal, close the show for us with your concluding remarks.
I just want to say that it is in India's deep interest that the current dispensation in Afghanistan survives, because we have to decide whether we want to fight Taliban in Kabul or we would like to fight them in Wagah or Srinagar.
All right. On that note then, we'll call it a wrap on this edition of India as well. But we'd like to hear from you as well. Do share your